A lot of people recoil at the word holiness. Perhaps you did just now. The reason is, one reason is because different people understand the word holiness to mean different things. And a lot of them are misunderstandings. For one instance, when people hear the word holiness, they think that person wants me to follow their rules. This is that kind of holiness that smacks of legalism. You know it when you run into it. They're happy to let you know the standard, and even more happy to let you know when you don't live up to the standard. You didn't know the rules before, but you do now, because you've broken them, and they let you know. It's that kind of holiness that makes a lot of us recoil when people assume that to be holy is to, meet my expectations of you. Another misunderstanding of holiness is the one that says, that doesn't have much to do with me. God is holy, and He's infinite and glorious, and I'm a mere mortal human and not infinite, and so God is holy, but I can't be holy. That sentiment was actually spoken to me by a member of a church I served once. He'd be fine with me telling you the story. He's on board now. But that was the sentiment. It's just a category confusion. God is holy, I'm not holy. And so the trouble when we recoil at the language of holiness, or when we assume that it's not about us, it's about God, the problem with that is all the way through the Bible, start to finish, Old Testament, New Testament, holiness is held out as God's intent for His people. What does God want? He wants a holy people. What is He out to do? He's out to save a people for Himself and make them holy. Story of holiness starts in Exodus. God calls Moses, says, Moses, I want you to go to Pharaoh. I want you to go in there and tell him to let my people go. He's not going to do it, but you're going to have to be persistent. You'll persevere. I'm going to do some stuff that's going to be persuasive, and then you'll bring my people out. And all of that happens. The people get out in the wilderness after they've been saved from slavery, and God brings Moses up on a mountain and says, I want my people to be two things. We talk about this often. Things you talk about often are things you should remember because they're important. I want them to be a priestly kingdom, and what kind of nation? A holy nation. Now the people are thinking, that's great. What does that mean? And God says, I'm glad you asked. I'll explain it to you. Read Leviticus. And so by the time you get to Leviticus chapter 19, you get this entire text of the Bible, often called the Holiness Code, which sounds scary, but it's not so much. Because the Holiness Code is filled with God saying, you shall be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy, which, by the way, debunks that second mistake we were talking about. It's not as if this is about God and not about us. God says, the very fact that this describes me means I want to offer it to you. And it means, Leviticus 19, honor your parents. Don't rip off the people who work for you. That's my translation, but that's what it says. Don't trip blind people, and don't talk bad about deaf people. None of that seems particularly legalistic, does it? Look out for the vulnerable. Don't take advantage of them. Offer yourself in love. That's what that holiness code is about. God says, that's what I'm like. I'm holy, the Lord your God, so you must be holy too. When you harvest your crops, leave some on the edge for the folks who are making their way through your town. So they'll have a little something for their journey. That's how I treat you after all. Now, lest we think holiness is an Old Testament idea that doesn't make its way into the New Testament church, we find that the language shows up all over the New Testament too. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 3, the Apostle Paul says to the Thessalonians, this is God's will for you. Anybody want to know God's will for your life? No one wants to know God's will for their life. I kind of thought I'd get a hand or two on that one. If you want to know God's will for your life, 1 Thessalonians 4, chapter 4, verse 3 says, this is God's will for you. Your sanctification, which is just the word for the process of growing in holiness. And Paul says that's God's will, not for one or two people, but for the church, all of us. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 25 and 26. Paul tells the church in Ephesus, Jesus gave himself for his church to make her, you should be getting the idea by now, to make her holy. Not just to forgive her, to make her pure and holy, without wrinkle, without blemish. The integration of the Old Testament vision of holiness and the New Testament vision of holiness is captured in 1 Peter chapter 1, where Peter just plain quotes Leviticus and offers it to the church. You shall be holy, because the Lord your God is holy. So we sometimes recoil at the language of holiness, often because it's been misused. But the Bible offers us that same language as the norm of God's purposes for our lives. If you were to just ask the Bible, what's the normal life for the people of God? The answer comes back on every page. Holiness. Now, when we read Mark chapter 7, we discover the Pharisees don't share our problem. If we recoil at the language of holiness sometimes, or at least if we don't recoil, we maybe struggle to integrate it into our daily lives. I mean, who gets up, pours their coffee, and says, how will I be holy today? I mean, a few maybe, but in general, I don't think that's how we start our day. I don't think that's the orientation in general. How will I embody the character of a holy God today? So even if we don't recoil, we may not be doing that. The Pharisees don't share the problem, because these guys in Mark 7 take up the language of holiness and the language of purity and just grab hold of it with both hands and do all kinds of things with it. And they will let you know what it means to be pure and holy. And they will tell you, and they have definitions and expectations, even for Jesus, especially for Jesus. And that leads to a conflict in Mark chapter 7, a very public conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees and some teachers of the law. They were publicly trying to shame Jesus. Your disciples don't do what they're supposed to do. And anytime you call somebody out in public like that, you're trying to shame them publicly. Jesus doesn't back away because he has an opportunity to help the Pharisees and the disciples and all of us to rethink holiness, to reconsider the misperception and embrace the biblical way that holiness is framed, the way Jesus embodies it, the normal life for the people of God. And so in the middle of this conflict, where Jesus is going to set some things straight, the one thing that rises to the surface, the one thing that we need to take and embrace and hold on to, is that holiness is less about an appearance of piety and more about a posture of love. That's the issue, isn't it? The Pharisees, we'll see in just a minute, are obsessed with the appearance of piety. Notice I said the appearance of piety, not actual piety. Piety just means worship, reverence, true honoring of God. You'll want to be a person of piety. authentic piety. Just the appearance of piety, Jesus says that leaves you open to the charge of hypocrisy, which is where we don't want to be, is it? But that's the issue. The Pharisees lean into purity and holiness for the appearance of honoring God. Jesus, by the time we get through the end of this passage, will have shown us that it's less about that and more about a posture of love for God and neighbor, especially neighbors that other people don't love. Now, before we dig into that, it wouldn't hurt us to ask the question, who were the Pharisees anyway? Do a little bit of reflection on that, because we know them as kind of the bad guys of the Bible. Everybody loves to hate the Pharisees, right? There's songs about them in children's church and Sunday school and things like that when you're a kid, and you don't want to be one and all that. In reality, in the ancient world, they're pretty well respected folks. Sometimes they're quite influential. Sometimes, at times, they wield significant power. After all, Paul, before he ran into Jesus on the Damascus road, the road to Damascus, was on his way as a Pharisee with authorization to arrest Christians and bring them back to Jerusalem. So here's a Pharisee who wields significant power and influence, who people defer to and respect. They weren't the bad guys of the ancient world. These are the guys who were the traditionalists. They were the conservatives. The Sadducees, well, they're the ones who gave up on everything that matters. They're the ones who don't believe in God's supernatural power to rescue his people. They're the ones making a bed with the Roman Empire. The priests in the temple, all kinds of abuses and compromises there. But the Pharisees, we're the faithful ones. We read our Bible. We memorize our Bible. We quote our Bible. And we will offer you our interpretation of it. These are people who are committed, they thought, to being faithful Israelites. And they thought that the compromises of the priests and the other parties, like the Sadducees, like that was the problem. That impurity, that profanity, that lack of holiness, that's the reason we're still slaves in our own land. So what do we do if that's the problem? Purify yourself. And that means wash your hands and your dishes. Now, they weren't just worried about cleanliness. It's a religious ritual that demonstrates in their minds being set apart for God. We'll come back to that in just a second. For now, let's just understand that these guys aren't here because they're disrespected in the ancient world. They're able to challenge Jesus in public because people take them seriously. And they think, they're deceived, I think, but they think that they're the ones who are calling Israel to be faithful when everybody else is compromised with culture. Now, Jesus is going to teach them that their understanding of that is misguided, but at least they get faithfulness matters when everybody else is compromised. So these are the Pharisees. How do we stay holy? How do we keep pure so that God will look favorably upon us and set us free from the Romans? That's their question. So Jesus shows up with his disciples, and the Pharisees criticize him publicly because they didn't go through a particular ritual of cleansing before their meal. Listen to it again. Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law, this is the beginning of chapter 7, had come from Jerusalem, gathered around Jesus, and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. And then you get that little parenthetical explanation, because Mark is writing to people who don't know what the Pharisees are always asking people to do. Jews would know, but Gentiles don't necessarily. Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, so you've gone, you bought some food, you bring it back, they do not eat unless they wash. Interestingly, the Greek word there is baptize. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups. Greek word there, baptize. Baptize their hands, they baptize their cups. Now, what's going on there? Well, this is a helpful reminder that the word baptize can be used in a variety of contexts for different religious rituals. Sometimes it involves the baptism of a person. In this text, it's the religious ritual washing of utensils so that they are ritually pure and cleansed. This is a helpful reminder. Sometimes on the internet, you'll hear people say that the Greek word baptize means immerse. This is a text that shows it does not, because they're not immersing these things. We actually have some outside of the Bible texts that talk about people baptizing sofas. I'd like to see what you immerse that in. All right, so this is a religious ritual that involves sprinkling, pouring, or immersion in water for anything that needs to be ritually made pure. That's what's happening here. That's what we're talking about. And Jesus' disciples apparently picked up some food and just started munching. Maybe they were hungry. I don't know. But that's what they did. And so there's a conflict, right? Because the Pharisees see the disciples as part of the problem. Hey guys, don't you realize we're in this mess, oppressed by Rome, because we're not pure, we're not holy, we're not ritually right before God? Wash your hands already. Jesus, why don't your disciples go through the ritual? Why don't they wash? Jesus is going to have to explain to them that the problem isn't dirty hands, the problem is dirty hearts. And so he responds. Hypocrites. When Isaiah was talking, he was talking about you. When he said, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human. And then he goes on to articulate one among many of what he calls their human traditions that really undermine God's word. And one of them involves this setting aside of money or resources of some type and pronouncing it Corban. This is another one of those things about Jewish culture we wouldn't know if Mark didn't explain to us. Corban, again, part of a religious ritual. And let me say this real quick. Rituals in and of themselves are not the problem. We do rituals all the time. We baptize people, we say the creeds, our worship follows a general pattern. Those are all rituals. The problem isn't the ritual, the problem is rituals that are not born out of hearts offered to God. When rituals become manipulative ways to get people to do what you want them to do, that's a problem. The people of God always engage in rituals. There's tons of rituals that are commanded in Scripture. That's not the problem. The problem is my heart offered to God in this act of worship? Or have I manipulated something to prop myself up and maybe put someone else down? And so Jesus says, here's a good illustration. You take some of your money, you put it on the table, you pronounce over it Corban, which is part of a religious ritual of setting aside money or resources for God. And if you do that, you can't use it to make a profit. It's there, it's off the table, it's set aside for God, it's dedicated to God. That's fine. Jesus says the problem shows up when your mom and daddy got to go in the nursing home and you're like, I ain't got nothing to help with, because you've dedicated the money to God. And here's why it's a problem, Jesus says. Remember that holiness code, Leviticus 19? Remember what the first commandment written in the holiness code is after God says, you shall be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy? honor your father and mother. What does holiness look like? It looks like other-oriented love to the people who've cared for you and deserve your respect. It's a relational thing. And so Jesus' critique is, like, if you take a good and right ritual and you use it to set aside some resources so you have a good excuse for not helping people that God commands you to help and says it's holiness to help them, that's a problem, and that's why he charges them with hypocrisy. They have the appearance of piety. They have the appearance of worshiping God. Look how much I gave. Here's someone in need. Oh, sorry. I don't have any cash on me. Jesus says holiness is less about the appearance and more about the posture. And the posture of their hearts isn't offered to God, is it? The posture of their hearts isn't offered to God in that place. So Jesus has to explain the solution to this problem. He calls the crowds together. Listen to me, everyone. Understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. Now, that may sound kind of confusing. Let me put it this way. The problem ain't out there, it's in here. If the problem were out there, you could wash it and it'd be fine. Take whatever the problem is, bathe it off real good, clean it up, and you're good to go. But Jesus says that's not the problem. The problem isn't external. The problem isn't over there. The problem isn't something I eat or how I wash my hands or the ritual. The problem is not external to me. The problem is inside of me. Now, the disciples still don't get it. Verse 7, they leave the crowd, they go into a house. Disciples, you may have noticed in Mark, frequently get things explained to them in a house. That's how it works. They're apparently too ashamed to ask, hey, Jesus, we don't understand you in public. So they go in a house. They're like, come on, man, help us out here. We don't know what you're talking about. Verse 17, he left the crowd, entered the house. His disciples asked him about the parable. And he says to them, are you so dull? Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? The problem isn't out here. You eat it. It doesn't go to your heart. It goes to your stomach. Then it goes out into the sewer. Jesus is getting a little forthright here. Instead, verse 20, what comes out is what defiles. The problem isn't external. The problem is internal. It's from within, verse 21. Out of a person's heart that evil thoughts come from. And then he just gives a list. And it's one of those lists that leaves no one unscathed. Like when Jesus makes lists, nobody gets off easy. It's from within. Out of a person's heart that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, folly. All of these evils come from inside a person. The problem starts with me. And some of them are like the big obvious things and visible. And other ones are not. And we may think we're fine till we get down to this malice business. And we realize, yes, I have harbored malice in my heart that no one else knows about. Jesus says again, the problem isn't out here, it's in here. It's not about washing up. It's about the transformation of your heart. It's not about modifying some behavior so that everything looks fine and dandy on the outside. It's about Jesus giving us the new birth. Born again. This is a good topic for Pentecost because Ezekiel connects this transformation with the work of the Spirit. Ezekiel 36, God rehearses through the mouth of the prophet the many and varied sins of the Hebrew people. They didn't get off easy either. And then he offers a word of hope, and this is what it says, Ezekiel 36:24. I'll take you out of the nations. You've been spread out. I'll gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land. I'll bring you home. I'll bring you home. And then I'll sprinkle clean water on you. I'll cleanse you from all your impurities, all your idols. The Pharisees wanted to sprinkle water on things too. They were sprinkling it on the wrong things. They needed God to sprinkle their hearts. And that's what he says. I'll sprinkle clean water on you. And when I do that, you'll be clean. I'll cleanse you from all your impurities. I'll cleanse you from all your idols. I'll give you a new heart. I'll put a new spirit in you, not just any old spirit. Ezekiel says, on God's behalf, I will put my Spirit in you. Hundreds of years before Jesus came, the prophet pointed forward to the day when God would act, when Jesus would cleanse his people with his very blood and send his Spirit to take up residence in his people, in our bodies, in his church, his temple, and do what? This. I will remove from you your heart of stone. Or the problem isn't dirty hands, it's a dark heart, a hard heart. I'll take out your heart of stone. I'll give you a heart of flesh, one that's soft, one that I can mold, one that I can shape, one that's responsive to my instructions and my commandments, one that hears my voice and obeys me. I'll give you a new heart, a heart of flesh, and I'll put my Spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. Which is another way of saying, when my Spirit takes up residence in your body, I'll empower you to honor me with your life. And the posture of your life will be changed. Away from a concern with the appearance of piety to a thoroughgoing posture of embodied love. After all, Jesus said, that's what it means to keep the law. Love God. Love your neighbor. Now, like the Pharisees, we can be good at the appearance thing, right? I mean, we know this. We can confess it. Christians know how to look like Christians. Amen? Nobody wants to admit it, but we do. We have Christianese, the language that we use in the church that no one else knows, but you know the terms, and that means you're part of the group, you're a good Christian. We know we're supposed to be here a couple times a month on Sunday. We want to be a good Christian. Doesn't really matter what our hearts are like as long as we show up occasionally. We know we're supposed to give. We know we're supposed to help clean up after events. Like, that's what good Christians do, isn't it? Like, we know what the appearance of piety looks like. Now, we need everyone to do all those things. But we want all of our serving and all of our speaking and all of our discipleship to grow out of a posture of love. God has loved us, and he loves us in Christ and the Spirit. And he reproduces that in the new hearts that he's given us. And that shifts us away from the appearance of piety to a posture of self-giving love. I like the word posture. I've kind of been hanging on to that word for about 2 years now. Read through the New Testament and we hear about holiness and the mind of Christ, Renew your minds. And sometimes we think, well, I just got to get my thoughts right. But the Bible's way more concerned with everything, not just the way I think. The Bible sees us as integrated whole human beings. And that word posture helps me think about a life integrated in its orientation to Jesus. Like my posture includes my thoughts, includes my heart. It takes up my emotions, my psychology, my body. A posture of love for God and neighbor is integrated discipleship. Holistic discipleship. That's the kind of transformation Jesus offers to us through His Spirit to shift us away from mere appearances of piety to authentic following of Jesus. Now, Ezekiel says when that happens, it has implications for the mission. When God shows up, when He cleanses you, when He takes out the rock, stony heart, gives you a malleable, soft heart of flesh. When He does that, it means He's going to show His holiness through you. There's that word. In Ezekiel 36, 23, says this: the nations will know, all the nations will know that I am the Lord, declares the sovereign Lord, when I show my holiness through you before their eyes. I call that missional holiness. How will the nations know that God is God? When He changes my character and yours. When He gives us the new birth and continues to make us new. The mission of the church rides on holiness that is a posture of love. Ezekiel connects those. Mark does too. You might have found that little story at the end curious, Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman. Jesus finishes talking about the things that defile on the inside, this corruption of the heart that all of us come into the world with and all of us need to be healed from, all of us. Mark says in verse 24, he left that place, went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and didn't want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence a secret. We've kind of learned that's standard for him at this point. He tries to go to a place by himself, people show up. Verse 25, in fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. Now, here's what you need to know about her. The woman was a Greek, which means she's not a Jew, which means she's an outsider. And even worse, she was born in Syrian Phoenicia, which, if you know anything about the history of the Jewish people, the Syrians, folks from that area, oppressed them a couple hundred years before and were the folks keeping them captive in their own land for that season. They had a lot of oppressors all through those centuries. The Syrians were just one of them. So not only is she a Gentile, an outsider, a non-Jew, she's from a place that is associated with the oppression of the people of God. She's got 2 strikes already, just looking for number 3. She begs Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. And then he says this, get ready. First let the children eat all they want, he told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. What? I thought Jesus was a nice guy. Did he really just say the food is for the Hebrew people, the children, and it wouldn't be right to throw the crumbs to the dogs, namely you Greek people? That's how a lot of commentators take it. And we're kind of thinking, what? How could he be so unkind? How could he be so abrasive? What's going on here? Isn't this a great opportunity for the mission? Here's a representative of the nations. Hasn't he come for her too? Well, this is one of those places where, again, Mark's Greek text matters. And it turns out, in Greek, there's not just one word for dog, there's two. One of them is the kind of dog that hangs out in the alley, scrounging around in the dumpster. That's not the one that hangs out under your table with your kids or your grandkids, right? So that's kind of the scavenger mongrel outside in the trash bin. That's the one you throw stuff at and try to get away. The other one, there's another word, and it's the word for a lap dog or a pet, an object of affection. The one that does hang out around your kids' chairs at dinner time because they're the ones most likely to drop something or just get a great idea that if the dog eats it, they don't have to. Two different kinds of dogs, two different words in the Greek language. Guess which word Jesus uses here? It's the pet that's an object of affection, not the mongrel in the streets. So what's going on? Jesus recognizes what the whole Bible recognizes, that the gospel comes first to the Hebrew people. God called Abraham and said, Abraham, I'm calling you special in your family to bless all the other nations. So it comes to you first, and then it comes through you to everyone else. There's a temporal ordering, there's a time, there are seasons. The Gospels are recording the season of ministry where God shows up in Jesus to Abraham's family, to his people. First, it comes to the children. First implies a what? Second. First, God calls Abraham. Second, he blesses the nations. First, Jesus comes to the Hebrew people, the Israelites. Second, the gospel goes out to the nations. And that's what Acts is about, isn't it? And the letters of Paul and the rest of the Bible. So what Jesus is doing here is making a distinction between the people through whom salvation comes. Paul says in Romans 1, salvation has come to the Jew first and then the nations, the Gentiles. And Jesus is making the same distinction, and he's recognizing, I think he's honoring, the fact that she recognizes something the disciples don't. After all, they were there when he took 5 loaves of bread and fed 5,000 or more people. They still didn't understand about the loaves, though. They didn't understand that when he gives you bread, it satisfies. She understands. If the bread comes from Jesus, all she needs is a crumb. If the bread comes from Jesus, all you need is a crumb. Because the bread of life will satisfy you. And so Jesus offers her his ministry, his bread, his affection. Go home. The demon has left your daughter. And he embodies in that moment the posture we've been talking about the whole time. You see the connection? The Pharisees, maybe even the disciples a little bit, different sort, but maybe, embody the appearance of piety. Jesus embodies a posture of love. If this lady had shown up with the Pharisees, as far as they're concerned, she's impure and can never be pure. Not only is she an outsider, she's from Syria. They're the bad guys, don't you know? She never would be considered pure in their system. She never could be integrated as far as they're concerned. If they only looked down their nose at her, that'd be getting off easy. I mean, listen to how they spoke to Jesus and his disciples, good little Jewish boys. Imagine if she'd shown up in town. So their appearance of piety would consider a woman like this permanently outside and impure. But Jesus takes a posture of self-giving, other-oriented love. I've got bread for you. I've got bread for you. When you get home, you'll find the demon has left your daughter. And the invitation in Mark is a movement from that appearance of piety place to that posture of love place. Posture which celebrates the good news that Christ has come for all. That when his arms are stretched and his blood was shed, his blood provides for the salvation of every woman and man. Where you're from and what you've done doesn't exclude you from his mercy. The invitation is an invitation to the one who takes a posture of love towards us. And then the invitation is to allow him by his Spirit to reproduce that posture in each of us. Now that involves him putting his finger on the places where we're still putting on appearances. Places where we withheld ourselves, places where there's impurity within, darkness within. Things like he names, malice, deception, all the others. Am I willing to let the one who loves me put his finger on those places in my heart? And those places could be different for everybody in the room. Am I willing to let him touch the dark spots so that he can make them pure and whole and clean and holy? So that he can fill my impurity with his holy love. And that won't be just good for us. It'll be good for the world. Will you pray with me? Jesus, Spirit of God, come. Our hearts are open. Won't you touch the places of malice, deceit, all the rest? You know the impurities that lie within. You know them better than we do. You know the places where our discipleship is a matter of appearance, even if no one else does. And you are able to touch those places with your perfect love, your unfailing love, your holy love. And as you do, oh God, as you touch each place, you sprinkle our hearts with clean water. You remove the stoniness, replace it with softness. Grant that our lives in their fullness will be marked by the same posture of love that you take to us, that will offer that to one another, to our neighbors, to the nations. Brothers and sisters, perhaps the Lord Jesus has his finger on a place in your heart. Don't resist. Confession is difficult, but his love is perfect. resist the good thing that he desires to do. We're going to sing. As we stand, you may want to pray where you are. You may want to come and kneel. But whatever you do, don't resist the one who loves you and gave himself for you.